Welcome to the web series Exploring 9/11, The World Before and After, a production of the National September 11th Memorial and Museum. I'm Clifford Chanin, Senior Program Advisor at the Memorial Museum. My guest today is Bernard Haykel, who's Professor in Near East Studies at Princeton University and also the director there of the Institute for Trans-Regional Study of the Contemporary Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. He is an expert on Islamic political movements and legal thought, and we're very happy to have him here today.
Thank you.
There's so much to discuss in thinking about the antecedents of al-Qaeda, where it comes from, but perhaps the broader picture of what modern political movements in the Islamic communities of the world have been through the 20th century is the way to get into the question of where al-Qaeda emerged from. How do you see modern politics intersecting with Islamic theology in the 20th century, and which strands led us towards al-Qaeda?
Al-Qaeda as a movement is a hybrid movement that emerges or that at least brings together various strains of Islamic political thought. Strains that don't always necessarily sit comfortably together. And I'll get to that in a moment. But you certainly have the Muslim Brotherhood, a movement that started in 1928 in Egypt, which was an anti-colonial movement and a movement that called for the Islamization of Muslim society, of Arab societies and Muslim societies, a return to Islam. You also have a strain of theological thinking that comes out of Saudi Arabia that is injected into al-Qaeda's thinking. This is a strain of theology that is very anti other kinds of Muslims. So it's not directed at non-Muslims, but rather at wayward Muslims, and tries to bring them back to a purist view of the religion. And then you have practical experiences, namely the failure of other ideologies to take root in the Middle East. So you have liberalism failed with the coups of the military officers that took place in Egypt and then in Iraq and in Yemen. You do have also the failure of nationalist and socialist ideologies, most perhaps emblematically seen in the Six-Day War of 1967, where Israel was able to defeat a combined force of several Arab armies, and also the promotion of various Middle Eastern states, Egypt amongst others, of Islamism as a counterweight to leftist ideologies. So, and then, of course, in addition to all of that, you have the war in Afghanistan, which gives the practical military experience to certain Islamic forces and groups to gain this practical experience and to bring the ideology and the practice together. Al-Qaeda is really a product of that, that history of great torment and failures of many other ideologies.
Let's take a step back, because I think it's important to situate these violent jihadi movements, if we can call them that, within the broader context of Islamic political development in recent years. How many steps back do we need to go to find the context into which this group, which we know today as al-Qaeda, but more broadly this violent ideological, theological stream of Islamic thinking, how many steps back do we have to go to find the origins of it? Do we step all the way back to the religion itself, to some particular interpretations of the religion? Where does that element of violence come in? And when does it become directed in the way it was against outsiders, or the U.S. in this case?
Right. So if you listen to al-Qaeda itself and how it presents itself, it says that it's, both its views and its practices are rooted in the very earliest understandings of the Islamic religion, and that nothing they do veers from that original interpretation, the original practice of Islam. This is contested. I think they draw on certain elements of early Islamic history and early Islamic practice and verses in the Quran. There's no doubt about that. They don't emerge sort of out of purely a 20th century context. I mean, there is a pre-modern context to al-Qaeda, ideas about jihad, ideas about defensive war, ideas about the infidel and what you can and cannot do to a non-Muslim. All of this is rooted in the Islamic tradition. The violence, though, that's directed particularly at other Muslims is something that is new, relatively new. It's an 18th century phenomenon that one could go back to. And then more to the point, the violence that's directed at the state, at wanting to capture a state, comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood experience. And the Muslim Brotherhood, I think, can be understood as a movement that is interested in power for power's sake, and uses Islam as an ideology for getting to that power. So they're opportunists, and they're not purists or principled people. Al-Qaeda has this element of opportunism in its ideology. It also, though, has this 18th century Puritanism that you find amongst the Wahhabis.
So that takes us back to Saudi Arabia and the origins of that particular stream of Islamic thinking in the Arabian Peninsula.
Right, and this is a stream that is called Wahhabism. It's a movement that started in the 18th century, and we can date it precisely to 1744, when you had an alliance between a religious scholar and a political leader in central Arabia, in a part of the Muslim world that was considered utterly marginal to the political and intellectual and cultural life of Muslims. So in this remote place, an alliance was forged, and a very powerful reformist, muscular ideology emerged. One that said that the Muslims of the time were actually bad Muslims or even infidels because they didn't worship in this purest, unadulterated way. The theology was not pure enough. And they fought against other Muslims, and they killed other Muslims, and they expanded the state, so that by 1803 they were able to take over Mecca and Medina, the two holiest sites in Islam, and this engendered a reaction from the rest of the Muslim world. Until today, most Muslims regard the Wahhabis as fanatics, as uncivilized and uncouth and boorish Muslims who are intolerant and who don't represent true Islam.